curious. What are maybe one or two things that stood out to you from yesterday that you took away kind of as a takeaway that you walked away with? Yes.
That was interesting that they found remains of like the dinosaurs. I thought that was cool.
Okay. Yeah. It is really remarkable. Yeah. Nick.
So, yeah, I enjoy the new perspective on like seeing like the older. I spent a whole life growing up like around a lot of younger groups, so it's cool to like get a approach it from a different perspective and like see really how the other side thinks of it, you know?
Yeah.
And, yeah, it's like mind expanding. You know, you get to see more of the actual videos, you know?
Yep.
So I just really enjoyed the overall lecture.
Good. Good. Yes.
Just a quick thought about, I thought the part on what an animal death was kind of interesting. I was like kind of designed for that. I never thought of that before.
Yeah. Good. Yes.
I thought the part about the microevolution and speciation being evidence for God providing for His creation is really cool. Just more perspective on it. I hadn't heard before.
Good. Good. Yes.
I just had a question. I've had like friends tell me that when they took like anthropology, they believe that like our human same species has been around for like 300,000 years. And like, how would you kind of answer that?
Well, we're going to get into that a little bit today, but I think it depends on what you mean by human. Okay.
I think like intelligent human.
Yeah. Well, because scientifically human is a term that refers to any organism, any creature that's part of the genus Homo. So that would be Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Neanderthals. So there's a large number of different species that fall underneath the category of Homo. Now, we are referred to as anatomically and behaviorally modern humans, or Homo sapiens sapiens. So Homo sapiens sapiens, people like us, have been around maybe 150,000 years. In that anything prior to that would be creatures that I would say were creatures that existed, but that they were not like us. And what distinguishes them from us is that we have the image of God and they don't. And we're going to talk about that idea of how we can show that we uniquely bear God's image. But yeah, so that's how I would respond to it. But the age of humanity and when we precisely appeared shouldn't be a point of consternation, because Scripture is actually silent on when Adam and Eve were created. So I hold to the idea that there was a real Adam and Eve, that Adam and Eve were the first human beings that were made by God, that everybody comes from Adam and Eve. But Scripture is actually silent as to when Adam and Eve were created. It's the text doesn't tell us. And so we really need to leave it up to science to help determine that, right? I don't know if that helps or is responsive to your question, or, yeah. You know, I mean, when somebody raises that question or that objection, they basically are trying to argue against a young earth interpretation of Scripture. And a lot of times people will equate the young earth interpretation of Scripture, which would argue that Adam and Eve were only around for 6,000 years. They equate that with what Genesis says. It's an interpretation of what Genesis says, but there's other interpretations. So the one that I hold to would be called an old earth perspective, and specifically a day-age view, where day is a period of time as opposed to 24 hours. And so from that standpoint, then it doesn't create problems for me if humans are around, for 150,000 years. Does that help? Okay. Anybody else? Yes.
I just really appreciate when you were talking about how your goal isn't to like convert to old Earth, but like you're a landing place for people with Earth, and there's other places for other people to go, and I just really appreciate that. I thought that was
Good.
a cool perspective.
Good. Good. You know, just to build off that point and just to reiterate this, when you get into some areas of your faith as Christians, they're going to involve ideas that are very complex when you start digging deep. And so when you talk about the relationship between science and faith, between science and scripture, there's so many aspects to that question that create a very complex environment. And very good people can wind up, who are equally committed to the Lord, can wind up in very different places. And so it's very important to create a space for dialogue and understanding, as opposed to demonizing anybody that doesn't agree with you. So that's really important for us as Christians to operate in that way, where we always are looking at how can I create unity and understanding and avoid creating division in conflict in the church. Okay, well, we're going to be talking this morning about human exceptionalism and the image of God in the age of Darwin. And one of the things that I find interesting about human beings is that we love to celebrate. Have you ever thought about this? That human beings love to celebrate. Think about that. How often do we celebrate something, right? We celebrate, key milestones in our lives. We celebrate our birth every year on our birthday. We celebrate when we graduate from kindergarten, from elementary school, junior high, high school, college. We celebrate engagements and weddings. We celebrate when people get their first job. We celebrate retirements. We even, in a sense, celebrate people's lives when they die, right, through funerals. We also celebrate key milestones in our community's history, right? We celebrate key milestones in our state's history or our country's history, right? So these are very important events. These are very important days that we commemorate with celebrations. But as human beings, we also are prone to celebrate things that have no real meaning, just simply because we want to have an excuse to celebrate. And that point was driven home to me a couple of years ago when a group of people at our offices, at the Reasons to Believe offices, which is the ministry I work for, decided that they wanted to have an afternoon dessert on May 4th to celebrate Star Wars Day, right? May 4th, may the 4th be with you, right? Are you guys familiar with Star Wars Day, right? And so there are even people on our staff that dressed up as Star Wars characters and came to work that way. And it's, I'm old enough now and crotchety enough too that I remember when Star Wars was released in the movie theaters. The original Star Wars movie was released in the movie theaters. And it was a phenomena. It was very, very popular. It was a pop culture phenomena at that time. But it's remarkable to me to see how over the years the Star Wars franchise has become so significant and so much a part of our pop culture that people actually celebrate Star Wars Day on May 4th. Again, just reminding us of the fact that we love to celebrate. Now, there's another celebration that takes place also that is interesting to me that you may or may not be familiar with. Are any of you familiar with Darwin Day? Yeah, every February 12th, which is the day that Charles Darwin was born, people around the world celebrate Darwin's life and his legacy on Darwin Day, February 12th. And this became a big deal in 2009, which was the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species and the 50th anniversary of the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birth. And so On that day, all over the world, people celebrated Darwin Day. And now you typically will see Darwin Day celebrated, particularly in university and college settings, where biology departments will host these Darwin Day celebrations. And a few years ago, I was invited to go to North Dakota State University on Darwin Day to do a debate with an atheist who was an evolutionary biologist. And Darwin Day is February 12th. I don't know what you guys know about North Dakota and what it's like in North Dakota, but believe you me, February is not the time of the year that you want to go to North Dakota. So there I am. Yes. So anyway, but the reason why people celebrate Darwin Day is because many people argue that Darwin's ideas revolutionized biology, that his ideas led to what's called the Darwinian Revolution that literally changed the shape of biology. And in fact today, and I mentioned this already, that people see Darwin's theory as being the organizing principle in biology. That as Theodosius Dobzhansky said, again to repeat what we talked about earlier, that nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. And of course, Darwin, with his ideas of natural selection and later sexual selection, explained how species could originate. But Darwin, as I mentioned already, went one step further, and he argued that this mechanism over long periods of time could actually explain everything that we see in biology. It could explain large-scale biological changes and account for the diversity of life, the biogeographical distribution of life, that it could even account for the adaptation and the appearance of design. And this is what is considered to be the central component of the Darwinian revolution, that Darwin took biology into a completely different direction. That historically, scientists studying biology prior to Darwin's day saw design in organisms. They debated things like, was function more important than form? But they all saw design. And what Darwin did is he stripped design out of biology, and he replaced the mind of a creator with the mechanism of evolution. And this is, again, a quote that we shared already, but it's giving us context here for what we're going to be talking about, where people like Richard Dawkins articulate this idea when they say natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process, which we now know is the explanation for the existence and apparently purposeful form of all life, has no purpose in mind. It has no mind, no mind's eye. It does not plan for the future. It has no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. If it can be said to play the role of a watchmaker in nature, it is the blind watchmaker. Now, when Darwin wrote on the origin of species, he was very careful not to engage the question of human origins. And it was about a decade or so later that he tackled the question of humanity's origin in his book, The Descent of Man, where he argued that human beings, like every other creature, are the product of evolution. That we're the product of evolution. And this is what he writes in his book. In a series of forms, graduating insensibly from some ape-like creature to man as he now exists, it would be impossible to fix on any definite point when the term man ought to be used. And so what he's saying here is that there must have been these transitional forms that went from an ape-like creature to modern humans, and that emergence of modern humans was gradual, where those qualities that we think make us special as human beings were already present in these creatures that preceded us, that we wouldn't even consider to be like us in any way. That there's nothing fundamentally special about us. We're not the crown of creation. We're not exceptional. We don't bear God's image. There's nothing special about us as human beings. And this is, again, I showed you this diagram earlier, But again, as we work through the implications, it means that human beings are just simply part of this vast evolutionary tree, that we're just part of the tangled branches of the evolutionary tree of life, where we're late appearing on the scene, we're a minor component in life's history, and that, again, evolution is an unguided, undirected process. The outcome is happenstance, and that human beings are simply a lucky accident of evolution. There's nothing in the evolutionary process that is moving in our direction, that intends for human beings to exist. Stephen Jay Gould said, "We must face the implications squarely. The origin of Homo sapiens as a tiny twig on an improbable branch of a contingent limb on a fortunate tree lies well below the boundary. In Darwin's scheme, we are a detail, not a purpose or an embodiment of the whole, with the details, whether good or bad, left to the working out of what we may call chance." In fact, this idea that human beings lack any kind of fundamental value beyond any other creature is an idea that permeates most secular colleges and universities. And in fact, if you argue that human beings are exceptional, that we are made in God's image, that we're the crown of creation, many people will treat that statement as being highly offensive. The very idea that is the core of human identity in a Christian worldview is considered to be deeply offensive in the world that we live in today. And people will accuse you of being engaged in speciesism, where that you are valuing human life more so than the life of other organisms on the planet. How could you be so arrogant? And people will look at you as if you have made some kind of racist comment or some kind of sexist comment. To commit an act of speciesism is equated in many people's minds with racism and sexism. Now, in addition to this idea of Darwin's theory, which today, as our culture becomes more secular, is permeating our culture, this idea of human evolution is infused in our thinking as a culture, right? And it undermines the biblical perspective, again, of human beings. There's another assault on the biblical view of humanity, and this is coming, believe it or not, from advances in technology, and we're going to talk about this more in the next hour. But we now have the ability through genetic engineering, through bioengineering, and other kinds of biomedical tools to modify human beings with technology, to enhance human beings beyond our natural biological limits, to make human beings, in principle, more intelligent, with greater strength and abilities, maybe even making us more psychologically well-adjusted. And that this is giving rise to a movement called transhumanism, which is this idea that we have a moral obligation to modify human beings using technology. And in fact, people who hold to a transhumanist perspective argue that we should actually use technology to take control of our own evolution, modifying human beings to create a set of post-human species that would be so different from us that we would not recognize them as anything like us. And the argument here is that if we are the product of evolution, then we have inherent flaws and limitations in our biological makeup. And that we should use technology to step in and correct those limitations, correct those flaws, because those flaws and limitations cause untold pain and suffering in our world. And by doing that, we can usher in our own type of utopia of our own making with technology. They go on to argue that as humans, if we are the product of evolution, we're going to continue to evolve into the future, so why not take control of our own evolution and direct it towards our own ends? And this idea of transhumanism, I'm going to skip this because we're going to unpack that more. This idea of transhumanism, for many people, undermines the notion of human exceptionalism. Yes?
So what's their, if they think we're going to keep evolving, what's their argument for why we haven't evolved over the amount of time we've been on Earth, which has been a pretty long time?
The argument would be that the time frame that we've been on Earth as modern humans, on the order of 150,000 years, we have seen, they would argue we have seen evolution. Now I would argue it's microevolution, but they would argue that we have seen evolution, that we are continuing to evolve. Right? So you can, yeah, that would be the argument.
Okay.
Right.
It's just micro, it's not macro.
Yes, yeah. But it, again, there's a worldview that argues that our origins are evolutionary in nature, right? That is a worldview. Okay.
Is evolution, like, does that include how long we live?
No. That would be considered growth and development. Right.
Like, I know before the flood, they lived long.
Oh.
Like 1,000 years almost.
Yeah,
and now
yeah.
we live barely 100.
Our lifespan, our lifespan has actually increased over time because of technology. And there are people that are transhumanists that think they can step in and actually extend our life expectancy on the order of hundreds of years.
But not compared to back then.
Well, you're looking at lifespans that would be comparable. Now, can that be done is another question, but that's something that's being considered. Yes?
Don't, like, the cells in our body have a limit on how many times they can replicate?
Yep. I'm impressed. The Hayflick limit. Wow. Well, there are people that think they know how to overcome the Hayflick limit. And it's through the use of an enzyme called telomerase. So the argument is that if you administer telomerase to cells, you can get them to replicate beyond that Hayflick limit. Yes?
I read somewhere that if we just had like unlimited ATP, our cells would never die.
No, because our cells have a programmed number of cell divisions, so our cells will die. And so what you're trying to do with the technology is to create immortal cells, but cells will eventually die. Yeah.
Do you think that'll ever happen?
Might. I mean, the ideas behind extending life expectancy are sound ideas. I mean, can you get them to work is another thing, but the ideas are not ludicrous, right? They're scientifically credible.
Do you think that goes against God's plan?
Yes. Yep, I do. Because we are, God granted us dominion over the creation, but he never granted us dominion over human beings. Right? And there's a difference between mitigating somebody's pain and suffering, treating a disease, versus trying to modify human beings. Right? And with an eye towards extending our life, taking control of our own life expectancy. That seems to me to be contrary to God's will. Yeah. But the idea of transhumanism in the minds of many people give another blow to this notion of human exceptionalism in the image of God. Peter Clark, who I actually debated on this question of human exceptionalism, said this: as a philosophical movement, transhumanism advocates for improving humanity through genetic modifications and technological augmentations, based on the position that there is nothing particularly sacred about the human condition. It acknowledges up front that our bodies and our minds are riddled with flaws that not only can, but should be fixed. Even more radically, as the name implies, transhumanism embraces the potential of one day moving beyond the human condition, transitioning our sentience into more advanced forms of life, including genetically modified humans, superhuman cyborgs, and immortal digital intelligences. And we're going to unpack this soon. But the point that I'm making here is this. Who are we as human beings? This question now is a pressing question unlike it's ever been before. Who are we as human beings? Are we creatures made by God in His image who are sacred, who have infinite worth and value, who are the crown of creation? Or are we merely the product of evolution in which we are no different than any other creature that has ever existed? And when we start looking at advances in AI now, where people are arguing about potentially attributing personhood to AI systems, or even attributing personhood to animals, where we can actually go in and modify animal brains, enhancing their intelligence, that should we consider those modified animals to have moral value, to have personhood as well? So this is a harsh, hard question that people are asking. And so what I want to present here is a scientific case that can be made for the biblical view of humanity, namely that we bear God's image. And this is connected to the idea of human exceptionalism. If we can show scientifically that human beings are exceptional, that we stand apart from all other creatures, we are, in a sense, demonstrating what Scripture teaches, that as human beings we stand apart from all other creatures. And we can show that what makes us exceptional are qualities that we would understand as being qualities that reflect the image of God. So in my book, Humans 2.0, I basically make this argument that the idea of transhumanism, the idea that we can, as human beings, can begin to conceive of modifying our bodies with technology, of taking control of our own quote-unquote evolution, is something that no other creature has ever been able to do, or has ever done, or has ever even proposed, or had the capability to do. And that in and of itself causes us to stand apart. The idea of transhumanism and the ability to execute it actually calls attention to our exceptional nature. Does that make sense to you? Human beings are the only species that exist today, or that have ever existed, that can create technologies to enhance our capabilities beyond our biological limits, work towards affecting our own immortality, and take control of evolution, ushering in a post-human world. These possibilities stem from our unique and exceptional capacity to investigate and develop an understanding of nature through science, and then turn that insight into technology. So in other words, the concept, the idea of transhumanism is actually, ironically, evidence that we are exceptional. Does that make sense to you? There's an irony there. That the argument is, again, transhumanism undermines our exceptional nature, but wait a minute, to even think of or conceive of that vision says there's something special about us. Now, a falling out of Darwin's theory of evolution is that human beings only differ in degree, not kind, from other creatures. This is what Darwin wrote. The difference in mind between man and higher animals, great as it is certainly one of degree, not kind. And so what Darwin was arguing here is that, again, we only differ incrementally from other creatures. There's nothing fundamentally special about us. Anything about us that we think is special has its antecedents in those creatures that precede us. And in fact, this idea has shaped anthropology for 170 years. Interestingly enough, there's a growing number of anthropologists who are actually challenging this idea, arguing that human beings actually differ in kind, not degree, from other animals. That these are evolutionary biologists who, as they look at the evidence coming from animal behavioral studies and other kinds of comparative studies, are forced to conclude that there seems to be something distinct or special about human beings that really sets us apart. Even though the mainstream thinking is that we differ in degree, the evidence indicates we differ in kind. And again, this is something that we can leverage to make a case for human exceptionalism and the image of God. One of those scientists is Thomas Pseudendorf, who wrote a book a few years ago called The Gap. And this is what he says, is that we reflect on and argue about our present situation, our history, and our destiny. We envision wonderful, harmonious worlds as easily as we do dreadful tyrannies. Our powers are used for good as they are for bad, and we incessantly debate which is which. Our minds have spawned civilizations and technologies that have changed the face of the earth, while our closest living animal relatives sit unobtrusively in their remaining course. There appears to be a tremendous gap between human and animal minds. Now, this is obvious. This is a self-evident statement, right? On one hand, you might say, well, there's really nothing that profound that Pseudendorf is stating. But if you think about this in the context of evolutionary theory, this is a radical idea. Because from an evolutionary perspective, there was this ape-like creature that was our ancestor that gave rise to humans, but as an evolutionary side branch, also gave rise to chimpanzees. And so the argument is that when you compare humans and chimps, there's obviously something fundamentally different between the two of us. And so the question is, what is that makes us different? What is it that makes us different in kind? And he says this, we find two major features that set us apart. Our open-ended ability to imagine and reflect on different situations, and our deep-seated drive to link our scenario-building minds together. Now, in other words, what he's saying, and others who hold his view are saying, is this, that as human beings, we have capabilities that are unique to us. One of them is symbolism. Do you know what I mean by symbolism?
Making symbols.
Right. We can represent the world with symbols. We can even represent abstract ideas with symbols. And we can combine them in all kinds of different ways to create all kinds of different types of meaning. We can create all kinds of different scenarios, real and imagined, with symbols. Symbolism and our open-ended generative ability to manipulate them is the foundation for language, it's the foundation for music, it's the foundation for art, which are qualities that are unique to human beings. We also have something called theory of mind, which means I can recognize that you have a mind just like me, and I can anticipate what you're thinking and what you're feeling. And in fact, as human beings, we have this drive to link our minds together, right? And we do that through social interactions. And the social structures we create to allow our minds to link together are unlike the social structures of any other creature. And so when you put these four qualities together in a package, this is what causes human beings to stand apart from all other creatures. And I would submit to you that these qualities are scientific descriptors of what we would understand to be the image of God. The image of God. And so what Pseudendorf says then is this, that this capability turns animal communication into open-ended human language. Now, what he means here is this, animals communicate, no question about it. Humans communicate as well, but what animals are doing when they communicate and what we're doing is separated by a gap. That symbolism suddenly causes us to do things that are unlike what animals do. That animals have memory, but we have mental time travel. That animals have social cognition, we have theory of mind. Animals can solve problems, we have abstract reasoning. Animals can engage in social traditions, but we have cumulative culture. Animals may have empathy, we have morality. That we really do stand apart, that we are exceptional compared to all other creatures.
Did you say we have morality?
Huh?
That guy said we had morality?
Now, let's put, I think the idea would be that we We are moral creatures, that we have rules, that we recognize right and wrong. Now, what exactly those rules are may differ from person to person, but we all have a sense that there is a right and a wrong. Now, and is it determined by something like, divine law? Is it determined by, cultural mores? That's debated, but we.
Still interesting that he thinks that.
Yeah, that we have, there is a morality, a moral system that we operate under, whereas animals don't have a sense of right and wrong. They don't have that understanding. Now, the next question is this. Well, what about the hominins, right? These creatures that presumably precede us in the fossil record. And just to reiterate, my particular view as someone who holds to the historicity of Adam and Eve is that these creatures are real, that they existed, that they had some level of intelligence and emotional capacity like all animals do, but I would argue that they lack the image of God. And I would include Neanderthals in that category. Now, it's interesting, though, in anthropology, there is a debate that's taking place among anthropologists as to whether or not Neanderthals were exceptional like us as well. Some people say Neanderthals were comparable to us as humans. Others would say that Neanderthals were fundamentally different. If Neanderthals are like us, that is, again, a blow to this notion of human exceptionalism. And there are claims that you may have seen that Neanderthals make art, jewelry, music, possess language, bury their dead, mastered fire. But all of these claims are controversial. They are because there are studies that refute these claims. And so this is an active area of debate. But let me just give you one example. I don't have time to go into all of this morning, but one example, the claim that Neanderthals made music. And this claim is based on this particular artifact in the archaeological record. This is interpreted as being a bone flute, which this is a hollowed out femur from a cave bear that looks like it has 2 holes punched in it. And this artifact was found at a Neanderthal site, at a single Neanderthal site. Now, this artifact has also been found at modern human sites as well. So it's a commonly occurring artifact in the archaeological record, but because it was found at a Neanderthal site, the argument is Neanderthals made music. But when people analyzed this bone flute in detail, they actually concluded that given the microanatomical features surrounding the puncture holes, the perforations, that it was probably produced by spotted hyenas, not by a deliberate tool punching holes in the bone. That spotted hyenas that were scavenging the remains of cave bears were biting into the femur, producing those kinds of holes. The point is that this is, again, a place that's heavily debated, but to me, the evidence that I think is most compelling why Neanderthals didn't have the symbolism and the capacities that we do as human beings comes from the trajectory of technology. Neanderthals were on Earth longer than we were on Earth, have been on Earth, and their technology was static. It didn't undergo any kind of advancement. We have been on Earth for a relatively short period of time, and we've gone from using primitive technology at our onset to putting somebody on the moon. These scientists made this argument, anthropologists made this argument. Our species was born in a technologically archaic context, and significantly, the tempo of change only began picking up after the point at which symbolic objects appeared. Evidently, a new potential for symbolic thought was born with our anatomically distinct species, but was only expressed after a necessary cultural stimulus had exerted itself. This stimulus was most plausibly the appearance of language. Then, within a remarkably short space of time, art was invented, cities were born, and people had reached the moon. Ian Tattersall and Jeffrey Schwartz say this: unusual though Homo sapiens may be morphologically, it is undoubtedly our remarkable cognitive qualities that most strikingly demarcate us from all other extant species. They are certainly what give us our strong subjective sense of being qualitatively different. And they are ultimately traceable to our symbolic capacity. Human beings alone, it seems, mentally dissect the world into a multitude of discrete symbols and combine and recombine those symbols in their minds to produce hypotheses of alternative possibilities. Symbolic and non-symbolic cognitive states are clearly separated by a qualitative gulf. The former is simply not extension of the latter, a little bit more of the same. In other words, what he's arguing here is we are the only creatures that display symbolism, that Neanderthals did not display symbolic capability. And you can't just simply go from a non-symbolic state to a symbolic state through these gradual transitions. They are fundamentally distinct capabilities. There's a chasm or a gap between us and Neanderthals. So in other words, the archaeological record gives us really powerful reason to think that, again, human beings are exceptional. And as I mentioned, again, these qualities that make us exceptional are qualities that I would argue are scientific descriptors of the image of God. And if anything exemplifies our capacity for symbolism, it is our ability to utilize language. And one of the areas that is of the greatest challenge in trying to explain the origin of humanity is how do we account for the origin of language? How do we account for the origin of language? And remember, that quote that I just showed you said that symbolic states and non-symbolic states are fundamentally different. You can't go from a creature that lacks symbolism to one that has symbolism in a stepwise manner. Chris Knight, who's a linguist, said this: language evolved in no other species than humans, suggesting a deep-going obstacle to its evolution. One possibility is that language simply cannot evolve in a Darwinian world, that is, in a world based ultimately on competition and conflict. The underlying problem may be that the communicative use of language presupposes anomalously high levels of mutual cooperation and trust, levels beyond anything which current Darwinian theory can explain, suggesting a deep-going obstacle to its evolution. So, again, what this is saying is that this is a challenge that doesn't seem to have any kind of solution from an evolutionary perspective. And it turns out that, as I mentioned earlier, and a couple of days ago, language emerges suddenly. It coincides with the origin of modern humans. It's unique to modern humans. That the first language was as complex as language is today. The hierarchical complexity found in present-day language is likely to have been present in human language since its emergence. By this reckoning, the language faculty is an extremely recent acquisition in our lineage, and it was acquired not in the context of slow, gradual modifications of pre-existing systems under natural selection, but in a single rapid emergent event that built upon those prior systems but was not predicted by them. The relatively sudden origin of language poses difficulties that may be called Darwin's problem. So the point that I'm making here is this, is that we live in an age that is influenced by Darwin's views of who we are as human beings. We live in a world where advances in human enhancement technology and AI press very hard on the question, who are we as human beings? It presses very hard on the biblical concept of human beings being image bearers, because human beings being the crown of creation, standing apart from all other creatures. Yet, people that are working in anthropology are growing in their recognition that we seem to be different than other creatures, and that difference, again, relates to qualities that we would understand to be the image of God. And so this idea of the image of God, ironically, withstands all of these assaults, that we really do stand apart. And if I had to make a case for the biblical view of human origins on a university campus in front of a hostile audience of evolutionary biologists, this is the presentation that I would make, is that we seem to be different in kind as human beings. And again, that is consistent with what Scripture says as the image of God. And this is very important because, as I said already, the image of God is the foundation for Christian ethics. It's the foundation for the gospel. All right? Any questions, comments, thoughts? Huh? Oh, yes, Nick.
At what point in humanity's microevolution would you say God intervened? Because if there's, I don't know, if it took a very, very long period of time before Adam and Eve were, brought to creation, right?
Yeah.
Like, says God formed them out of the dust of the ground. Does that mean he micro-evolved them into being, or does that mean he straight formed them and then made them and gave them life?
When I look at the wording in the biblical text, it seems to me that God is directly involved in the creation of Adam and of Eve. That it's a direct personal action on his part. That it's not through some kind of process. So, I would say that when we see modern humans appear on earth, that is the point where God is stepping in and creating us, both physically and spiritually. Right? So there's an intervention that's taking place at that point.
And I don't know if this is if there's any way to know this about the first people or the first humans, but kind of like something Lexi mentioned with her question of people living for hundreds and hundreds of years. And is there any evidence of that in a fossil record or in science?
No, there's no evidence for that in the fossil record. And to me, what I think gives that idea credibility is the fact that we are beginning to understand the biology of aging, of the aging process, and have ideas on how we can intervene. And there are, biogerontologists who think we can extend human life expectancy well beyond, several hundred years. So that, and it's through, in some instances, relatively subtle manipulation of our biochemistry. So what I see is God creating human beings with those long lifespans initially, in that, as Genesis 6 said, the only thought in the heart of every person was evil all the time, is that those long lifespans were essentially being abused in propagating evil because of the wickedness of the human heart. And so God stepped in and altered our biochemistry in such a way that our life expectancy was shortened to no more than 120 years. And so it's possible in principle to reverse that. We're beginning to understand how that could be done. But there's a whole host of ethical questions connected to extending life expectancy.
Yeah, it sounds like people are trying to step into the place of God and
Yeah.
undo what he's done. It's a dangerous place to go. But
Right.
how much of that, of humans' life expectancy changing, do you think was based off of biochemistry? How much do you think was environmental? Because I know the environment of our planet has changed quite a bit since.
It probably is a combination of both. It could very well be a combination of both. Hugh Ross, who I work with, has argued that there was a supernova eruption at about that time that showered the Earth with cosmic radiation that would shorten life expectancy. But I think it was probably biological too. it's clear that God stepped in and intervened when I read the text.
The other thing that, like, before the flood, there was giants, and they obviously intermarried, eventually got shorter, and they're no longer. But is that a form of evolution or not?
Yeah, well, the Nephilim, yeah. I have no idea what's going on with that passage of Scripture. So I'm reticent to speculate, but as to who the Nephilim were. So to me, it's one of those mysterious portions of Scripture that there are people that have offered explanations, and they're very courageous in doing so, I think. Let me take her question. I'll take you. Yeah.
What was their question? It was about that.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Sorry about.
Alice, have they found any bones of the Nephilim?
I don't think so. Any other questions? Okay, well, why don't we take a break? Who's teaching in here at 11?
John Inns.
Who?
John Inns.
Oh, John.
Pastor.
Okay. All right, so we need to make sure we're done with the second. So why don't we, is 10 minutes too short of a break, or do you guys need long? Okay, so why don't we come back at about 5 after? Oh, you're welcome.